just as our bodies are made up of elements and the stars are made up of elements and a table is made up of elements, it's so incredible to think that all of the same elements are being used for everything in the universe, but just put together in a different way. And I find that important to remember, to relay back to as we study five element theory in Chinese medicine, because it's just that microcosm, macrocosm remembrance of coming back to kind of like the big scope versus when you get so tunnel vision into theory, you always want to take a step back and look at the big picture. So on that note, the five phases, Wu Qing, is an attempt to classify phenomena in terms of five quintessential processes represented by the emblems wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And its place in Chinese medicine, as well as many other intellectual pursuits, have been misunderstood ever since the first Occidentals were applied to explain Chinese natural philosophy to the West over 300 years ago. During this century, the academic world has made some advances towards a better appreciation of five-element theory. And the Chinese term that we use to translate five phases is Wu Xing. Wu is the number 5, and Xing means walk or move. And it perhaps implies a process as opposed to an element itself. So it's important to think of element in a different way that we normally think of it in English, more of a movement, a process. And the theory of the five phases is a system of correspondences and patterns that subsume events and things, especially in relationship to their dynamics. More specifically, each phase is an emblem that denotes a category of related functions and qualities. And the phase wood is associated with active functions that are a growing phase. Fire designates functions that have reached a maximum state of activity that are about to begin to decline or a resting period. Metal represents functions that are in a declining state, whereas water represents functions that have reached maximal state of rest and are about to change. So we're just looking at it in forms of like positioning and in movement, like physics. Finally, earth designates balance or neutrality in a sense. Earth is the buffer between other phases. And the five phases correlate observable phenomenon of human life into images derived from the macrocosm. Like I mentioned before, they serve a similar function as that of elements in other medical systems. And the five phases can be used to describe an annual cycle in terms of biological growth and development. Wood corresponds to spring, fire to summer, metal to autumn, and water to winter. And earth, what is that? That's this transition state, right? So it's where the chi of the body goes back inward in between the seasons. So that's why our immune systems tend to get weak, and there's that like flu season and stuff, because the body's defense is actually going inwards, and we don't have as much defense on the exterior in those transition cycles, and more on that later. The five phases, or the five elements, were not documented until the 4th century BCE. And some imitation of the five phases can be found in many writings around the period from 500 to 200 BCE. And it was a time of great intellectual and political social ferment in China. So the five-phase theory was interestingly looked at, or the emphasis of the theory was as much political as it was scientific. And the first sort of dated systemized theory of the five elements was by someone named Zhou Yan, approximately 350 to 270 BCE, and it was created by him and his followers. The five element theory did receive quite a bit of criticism in its early stages, especially due to the challenges in its practicality or veracity. But despite the early criticism, the five-phase theory became an important framework in Chinese medicine. And one reason for this is that the Chinese investigative study tends to be inductive only to a point, and then proceeds with deductions based on the classics, the four classics that I mentioned on my page, right? The Huangdi Jing, Su Wen, as well as the Jingui Yao Wei, the Wen Bing, and the Shenghan Lun. So it always goes back to the classics. And despite there being different the classics might not mention, some of the classics might not mention the five element theory, some do, but despite that, it is used today in Chinese medicine. There's actual whole schools in the UK and maybe elsewhere that are based off treating their patients strictly with this principle alone. The way I look at the five element theory is it's like one of the many tools to have in your tool belt as a doctor of Chinese medicine. So when you are in practice and you are treating people, maybe it's not the best approach for every pathology, but there are certain pathologies where the five element theory comes in just so perfectly. So it's always better to have more tools in your belt than less, right? And the application of the five elements or phases to seasonable growth is only one example of how the system was used. So there are corresponding elements to the seasons. There's also the five generic categories for classifying many more perceptions, from colors, sounds, odors, tastes, sensations to emotions, animals, dynasties, even the planets, and ultimately everything in the universe has a corresponding element. So the correlations that were also made between the phases and the various organs and anatomical regions in the body was basically how the connection between phases, or the five elements, and medicine came about. And I find that really interesting because in Chinese medicine, there's colors and tastes pertaining to organs, and so there's also an element that's pertaining to each thing, and it's something that you memorize very early on and never forget, but it's interesting to know where it came from. The five phases are often used to describe clinical processes and relationships and to help in the conceptualization of proper treatments. And the five phases are also used to describe general processes that take place during the annual cycle. That sequence, the mutual production order of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, describes normal generative functions. In that sequence, the producer is called the mother and the produced is called the child. Some patterns of disharmony can be explained by reference to the mutual productions order, especially patterns of deficiency. And as I'm writing out here, in case of deficiency, tonify the mother, and in case of excess, sedate the child, which is the treatment principle for the five element theory. The child of a deficient mother, for instance, becomes deficient for want of proper nourishment. Conversely, when the child is deficient, it may steal the chi of the mother, making it deficient as well. If an organ is deficient, the treatment can be effected by strengthening the mother organ. When there's an excess of an organ, or in the organ, the child can be drained. The concept of treatment is important in acupuncture, but is seldom used in herbal medicine. And another sequence that goes around the star, not in a circle, but in clockwise around the star shape, is known as the mutual checking or mutual controlling order. I call it the mutual, or it's an overacting sequence as well. So there's many names for one thing in Chinese medicine, which can be confusing, but you just have to memorize all of them and know they mean the same thing. And in this sequence, each phase is said to check or control the succeeding phase. The control order, like the mutual production order, describes naturally occurring phenomena, and it works because, right, you're going clockwise around it still, even though it's a different, not the circle, but the star, you're still going clockwise. And it works to ensure that the mutual production order does not overgenerate and cause imbalances. So a disharmony within the control order might mean that an organ is exerting excess control over the organ that it regulates, and this would lead to a deficiency in the regulated organ. Or the organ that should be regulated may become the regulator. So other situations can arise, but these are the two most likely. And the former imbalance is known as the insulting cycle, or you can also call it the counteracting sequence or cycle, and the latter as the overacting sequence. Now I'm showing the counteracting sequence, which goes the opposite way of the overacting sequence. And that's how these elements or organs can affect each other. And we're just talking about the elements right now. So the mother-son relationship, you have the mother promotes the son, the mom can overact on the son, and the son can counteract on the mom. And under normal conditions, water promotes wood. Abnormally, water affecting wood is known as mother affecting the son. And wood affecting water is known as the son affecting the mother. And then here I'm showing the relationship between the mom and son and how you can use the points of the 5 elements to treat various pathologies of the 5 elements. So for instance, the lung meridian, like every meridian in the body has a water, fire, earth, metal, and wood point. And say you have someone who has the liver overacting on the spleen, like I was showing there, you would look at your chart and the liver's overacting on the spleen. So what are you doing? Well, in case of deficiency, tonify the mother. So what's the mother of wood, the liver? That is water. So you are going to choose the water point of the liver meridian, which is liver 8, referring back to your chart. And then here I'm showing liver fire, or like some excess liver condition affecting the heart. And so it's an excess, so you're sedating the child. And you would choose the fire point of the liver meridian, which is liver 2. So that part can get a bit confusing. It's important to always remember your Jing-Well points are different at times, sometimes the same, but some are different from your 5 element points. So to keep those separate when you're memorizing them. Here I'm referring to Giovanni Maziosa's description, and a lot of other textbooks have it as well. But the relationship between the heart and the kidneys, or the mind and the essence, and how it's describing here how the heart and the kidneys have a direct vertical axis connecting them, and it's not just like an indirect connection through the liver, how it has it in the 5, like the star situation of the 5 elements. And the relationship between the heart and the kidneys is extremely important in Chinese medicine for many reasons, and just for balance of overall yin and yang. They are like, the heart is like, the ultimate yang, and then the kidneys are like the ultimate yin organ, right? Because it's like pure yin, pure yang, and then you have this constant necessity to, the kidneys sort of like a light sprinkler, imagine, sort of like spits up water in a gentle way towards the heart to keep it not flooded, but also not over exhausted like an engine that doesn't have oil, right? So it keeps it at this nice kind of moistness and temperature. And then if that becomes weakened, your kidneys get weak for whatever reason, which all of ours are with adrenal exhaustion at times, then you have or just not exhaustion, but adrenal like deficiency or stress. But you have this weakening of the kidneys, and so then the heart fire flares up, causing all sorts of symptoms. And then also the opposite, right? The relationship between the heart and the kidneys. If the heart's too excessive, burning up too much, and it, kind of dries up the water of the kidneys, you're going to see pathology there as well. So the 5 elements are extremely, like here I'm showing the liver Qi deficiency. You would use the water point again on the liver meridian to treat that condition, so liver 2. The aspects of diagnosis that are related to the 5 elements that are discussed are colors, sounds, smells, emotions, tastes, sense orifices, and climates. So there is an element related to each of those, and I have charts on those coming up that you can screenshot. I won't read them out in detail. I do want to speak briefly on the 5 elements in herbal and diet therapy, and how the 5 corresponding tastes to the 5 elements are used in practice with herbology often. It states in the spiritual axis, or the spiritual pivot, the Ling Shu, the sour taste goes to the liver, the bitter taste goes to the heart, the sweet taste goes to the spleen, the pure or the pungent taste goes to the lungs, the salty taste goes to the kidneys. If the liver is diseased, one should not eat pungent foods. If the heart is diseased, one should not eat salty foods. And that goes back to what we learned about the mother-son relationship, sort of, right? So if the spleen is diseased, that's the earth element. One should not eat sour foods, the liver, because that would mean that the liver is overacting on it. So you need to like reduce the liver. So reduce the sour to let the heart build itself back up again. And then in the case if the kidney is diseased, one should not eat sweet foods because the kidney is probably being attacked by the spleen and stomach. So you're trying to eliminate that attack so that the kidney can build itself back up and be tonified. And if the lung is diseased, one should not eat bitter foods. The bitter is the taste corresponding to the heart. So you're reducing the heart excess on the metal element or the lung. So it's all going back to that 5-element theory, even in the tastes. So obviously if an organ is diseased, one should avoid the taste relating to the element that controls that organ along the controlling sequence. For example, the salty taste pertaining to water overacts on fire, and therefore an excess of salt may injure the heart. So it can get quite complex, but it's just really basic and simple at the end of the day if you keep it that way. And I hope you learned something and enjoyed the video. Just kidding. There's one other thing I wanted to mention before I leave you. The same thing that I described about the tastes can apply to the emotions. And I didn't go over everything, but the emotions related to the 5 elements or the corresponding emotions to the 5 elements are joy, anger, worry, pensiveness, and grief and fear. So anger pertaining to the liver or the wood element is necessary in like a small, like it's in balance, right? If contained. But if it's in excess, that's where it becomes a pathological situation detrimental to your health. So that sounds strange with joy, right? Like, oh, how can too much excessive joy be a bad thing? Well, it can be. Too much excessive joy disturbs the chi of the body and the balance of the yin and yang in the body and upsets the system. So it's not that you can't have any joy, but you want to keep it within a certain, you don't want to be like, you know, somebody who's laughing all the time and those people that like can't stop laughing, they're just uncontrollable on the floor, like nothing's funny, like that's a heart condition, 100%. Like not to the point where they need to get hospitalized, but maybe there's some sort of like, you know, trauma, like heart chi deficiency from something that happened in their past, or you know what I mean? So it's definitely bad as somebody who wins the lottery and they're just jumping for joy and they have, you know, maybe they're really unhealthy already and then they're so excited that they have a heart attack. So too much joy can be a bad thing. So the emotions are interesting in correspondence to the 5 elements in that too much of them in excess can damage the organ pertaining to the 5 elements. However, and not enough also can damage them. So it's about finding that balance, right? And like there's a necessary amount of fear and a necessary amount of thinking, pensiveness that we have to do, the spleen meridian. But if we're just always obsessively thinking all the time and super like in our heads, like pensive, we can damage the spleen. So we have to be careful with that. And I could go on and on with all of the stuff, but the spirit are really interesting as well. Like the kidneys pertaining to willpower and the Hun being the spirit that pertains to the liver or the wood element. And that's the only spirit that doesn't die with the physical body. The Po is like the spirit connected to the lungs. That's like connected to your breath. And so on. So, and then obviously heart, your shens, that's like your mind, your spirit. So really interesting stuff. The 5 elements I could talk about forever, but I will end it here. And I hope you enjoyed the video and stay tuned for Jingui Yao Wei coming next, as well as Zong Fu Theory and then the Extraordinary Meridians.